Hi, this is George Salinas here. Today, as part of a series I've developed called What's That All About? We're going to look at the differences between truth and opinion through a series of slides. In essence, truth versus an opinion. In a world flooded with voices and opinions, how does one determine what can really be trusted? Can every voice claim to be true? Of course not. Or is there a way to know the difference? Well, you'll see in this graphic here that on the left, I've created a word called truth opinions. Well, that word sort of reflects a world in which it's hard to determine what is true and what's not true. How many times have we heard someone say fake news? On the other hand, there is a way that we're going to take a look at of determining what is indeed true versus what is rather an opinion. So the problem today isn't the shortage of opinions, it's knowing which, if any, carry real weight and not false promises. Imagine being tossed around in the sea versus finding stable, secure place on ground. One place being restless, the other place being secure. So let's look at how to determine what tells us the difference. So we're going to take a look in this first slide series on the question of truth and opinion by looking at some definitions from the dictionary on both words. So for example, with truth, it is the actual state of matter, or two, a verifiable fact or principle. Three, it would be the state or character of being true. Four, an obvious accepted truism. Or even five, accuracy, such as in a particular position taken. On the other hand, let's take a look at what the dictionary says is opinion. Opinion is a personal view or appraisal. It can also be a belief that rests on maybe insufficient grounds to produce certainty. Third, an opinion can be a professional judgment or ruling, or in the case of a legal matter, is simply described as a ruling. So there is quite a difference between these two words. Truth is verifiable. On the other hand, truth is quite different from an opinion which may not be verifiable or may indeed be inaccurate. So with that, we're going to take a look at a quote here. The quote says, "The unexamined life is not worth living." So who said that? Well, this was said by Socrates, the great philosopher and apologist, eons ago. So with that, we've finished slide one. Let's go to slide two and take it one step deeper. Oh, in slide two here, let's talk about what I call the parade of opinions. In the illustration on the right, we see a little statement that I wrote up. It says, "Truth is not a matter of faith, but the logical conclusion of what is actual." On the other hand, opinions may be a series of promises. Well, we promise that if you believe this, then this is what the result is going to be. So, in this particular case, obviously, the issue is they're a matter of many opinions that can many times parade themselves as truth. Many people will say, "You have one truth, I have my own truth." But when that happens, what kind of result do we end up with? Well, perhaps confusion, division. People can become even restless. Opinions can even be simply moved by the wind. It's my way of looking at it. It's your way of looking at it. In a certain sense, it's kind of like the waves in an ocean that go to and fro, restless and unstable. Whereas if we're talking about truth here, are we really talking about just making promises, or can it be manifested for what really is? Well, the challenge is, how are we looking at what is the question that is at hand? You know, what kind of glasses are we using to look at something? Here we have a little diagram. Here's a box. So, what is the box that we are looking at? What's the color? What's the shape? And so forth. All of these things are either a question of this is what we think something is, or this is the reality of what it is. So, I have a quote that I'd like to read to you. The quote says, "When truth is relativized, power rules. Whoever controls the levers of culture decides what's true for the moment. This is a dangerous world." Well, the one who wrote that was a well known writer who also served in administrations of the president's office in the United States, Charles Colson. So, again, when we talk about truth and we talk about opinions, we have to start asking the question, what is real and what is not real? This slide that we're going to look at now, I will call the solidity of truth. So we're going to take a look at solidity versus unreliability. As I've mentioned before, opinions will come and go. They will rise and fall, and in many cases, depending on the subject and whom you ask, opinions can become merely a popularity contest. Real truth, on the other hand, will not and cannot fluctuate over time. So I'm going to take a look at a well-known verse here. The verse says, "A wise man who built his house on the rock." Of course, not on sand, because storms are going to come. So who said that? Well, that was Christ of the Bible. So the image on the left shows a stable structure, reliable, whereas the image on the right shows the results of unstable structure, undependable. It's going to collapse. So, of course, what we have here is we have our structure on the left that is going to be stable, whereas our structure on the right is going to be subject to failure over time. And the key has to be, what type of foundation or what type of soil do we have? So the point being is, if we have a building that's been built on obviously poor soil, then we're going to get shaking. Whereas, of course, if we build a structure on solid ground, as I've learned as an architect, then when we do that, we're going to have a structure that lasts over time. Time, of course, is going to take its toll. So, truth in that respect is going to be tested, but it's going to endure the storms that it faces versus opinions that over time simply will not hold their mustard, so to speak. So with that, we're going to go to the next slide. With this slide, we're going to look at the point of view of lasting versus temporal. Testing is an important task to separate fact from fiction. For example, gold and silver must be tested by the refining of a crucible. The crucible burns away impurities. Iron, likewise, must be tempered and forged by heating to obtain a lasting strength. So it is with truth and opinion. Time and evidence strip away illusion. So here's a quote. I'm going to read you the long portion. You're going to see the short portion. It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. If it doesn't agree with experiment, the facts and results, it's wrong. The author of this quote was Richard Feynman, a world-renowned physicist. So we're going to take a look at what I call the triple test of truth. So first of all, we're going to look at a word called correspondence. In the term of correspondence, does the results match observable reality? To be truth, it must align with fact. Let's take a look at our second principle of testing truth. That's going to start with the term called coherence. The question with coherence is it internally consistent and logical? If it is true, then it must align with reason. The last principle I want to look at in terms of testing between truth and opinion is consequence. The question here with consequence is, does the test produce good and lasting fruit? If it is truth, it must align with moral truth as well. So testing over time requires all of these tests. Lacking any separates opinion from truth. Likewise, a litmus test. These three principles of testing can bring us closer to the reality of truth. When tested, opinion can produce division, confusion, and even decay. On the other hand, truth will produce clarity, consistency, and life. Let's go to the next slide. So let's take at our slide 5 here in what I title root versus fruit. Here we're going to take a closer look at the idea that a root determines the resultant fruit. As we've seen before, proper testing, which I can describe as questioning, will validate truth, providing a clear result and answer. On the other hand, opinion can yield a questionable result, and logically, this is understood. So if one's premise is grounded by a solid foundation, it will endure. The focus here is on how it's rooted. So let's take a look at the two images displayed here and how science validates the truth. On one side, we have a fruitful plant, well-rooted. On the other side, we have a barren plant that in this case is not rooted well in the soil. So, what we want to think about here is what can science do to help bring clarity to what we're trying to understand about what we are looking at. So, what I'm drawing here is basically a little magnifying glass. And in that magnifying glass, which we have here, we're going to take a look at what we want to consider in regard to the plant and whether or not it is producing fruit. So here's just a little illustration of looking at a plant under the microscope, so to speak. So science looks closer. It magnifies what's already there. But what it reveals can point back to the deeper truth. In that light, observation then leads to revelation. Even in the lab, it can be shown that truth will endure for all seasons. A plant with deep roots and with rich soil can yield good fruit, whereas a plant with shallow roots and poor soil ultimately become barren. It's a question of biology, really. So let's take a look at a scientific quote here. Shallow-rooted species show rapid early growth, but are less resilient. Deep-rooted species persist across seasons and disturbance cycles. Well, this is a quote from a research report by a botanist named Springer in 2007 in a report described as Plant and Soil. So, from a botanist's point of view, this conclusion is obvious. A plant without deep roots may look alive for a season, but only truth will keep that plant standing when the winds of change blow. In other words, truth is going to be rooted solid when looked at carefully, whereas opinion over time will eventually wither away. So let's go ahead now, take a look at the next slide. The following slide is definition versus blurring. So what we're going to take a look at here is the fact that truth requires definition. Truth without definition becomes opinion. To define means to draw a line in the sand, so to speak. To separate precision from vagueness. Without definition, there's only blurriness, and where there is a blur, distortion thrives. Clarity is moral vision. It is more than simply understanding, having comprehension. It means to also be justified as well. In an age of relativism and confusion, moral insight helps construct and establish clarity. And when that is taken place and truth is defined and clarified, deception loses its disguise and grayness. So, for example, we have here two images. On one image, we have a person standing on solid ground, unshakable, whereas on the image to the right, we see someone standing in the sea, like the sea that's chaotic and turning and changing. So what we want to think about here is, for example, when we think about truth, what we need is to understand that truth will yield definition. Secondly, truth will yield clarity, which also then yields vision. So we're going to be able to understand what we're trying to achieve and what we see, why it matters. And then thirdly, we want to take a look at how truth must be a part of integrity. Integrity is going to yield the right actions. In other words, when we act in integrity, we know how we are going to respond. It's not going to be shifting here or there. So all of these things are important definitions that can lose their meaning, and the soul of a people can be rewritten if we don't understand where we are. Language is not neutral. It is the front line of truth. So, for example, in this quote, you're going to be able to see where it says, I prefer to be true to myself, longer version, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and to incur my own abhorrence. Now, that was spoken by the abolitionist and orator Frederick Douglass. So when we think about these things, when we think about definition, and we think about vision, and we think about actions, this gives us a better understanding of the contrast between the words that we use. So let's look at a popular use of euphemisms. The definition for euphemism is the substitution of a mild, indirect, or vague expression for one word that was going to be thought to be too offensive, harsh, or blunt. We see this every day in the political realm. To live by truth is to stand where the line is drawn, as we have said before, even when the world prefers the blur. Too often, opinion arises from these euphemisms, which can lead to blurring and misdirection. Clarity will come from speaking clearly, not through blurring. So, with that, let's go to the next slide. In this last slide, number 7, we're going to look at how truth endures. We want to recap and take a look at the distinctions between truth and opinion. In slide 1, the question of truth and opinion, we looked at what common definitions say about these two words. Truth must be verifiable. With slide 2, the parade of opinions, we saw how truth remains consistent, whereas opinions will vary. There'll never be a lack of opinion, but rather we must look at what holds up over time. Slide number 3, the solidity of truth. We compared how truth becomes solid. Opinions over time begin to crack. In slide 4, the principles of testing, we saw how both truth and opinion must be tested. Time and evidence will strip away the illusions. For slide 5, root versus fruit, the root determines the resultant fruit. Truth will be deep-rooted and resilient, not so with opinion. In slide 6, clarity versus blurring, we focused on precision versus vagueness, how relativism will get one nowhere and invite illusions to thrive. Truth, on the other hand, demands integrity. Shifting seas of opinion won't provide us with the path to our question on truth. We must not settle on opinions that come and go. Truth is the path that will produce results that will endure. So here's a quote. Truth is not proven by permission to differ, but by results that endure. Well, this is an anonymous quote. So where are we in our discussion on truth versus opinion? Well, I had 3 questions as we wrap up our discussion. One, what are we building on? Is it shifting seas or the firm land of truth? And finally, what will produce results that will endure? I hope that you found this chat constructive and helpful. Onward and upward.